Welcome to the Catholic Voices podcast. I'm your host, Brendan Alejandro Thompson, and it is my pleasure to be in St. Patrick's, Soho Catholic Church in London with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, it's great to be with you.
Brendan, good to be with you.
And we're here because you're on a tour of London, on a mission of London for the week. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but I've been really excited to talk to you about your approach to public speaking and preaching. One of the best introductions I ever heard of a speaker was the speaker came on stage and they said, I want to thank God for all of the hours of prayer that this person has spent, all of the quiet study, all of the conversations that they've had that have led them to this moment. So, kind of like if you look at an iceberg, everything below the waterline. And then I was conscious as I looked through all your content, I don't think you've ever spoken, say, publicly about that kind of, under the hood of Bishop Barron's approach. And
yeah. It calls to mind Fulton Sheen. And of course, we're at this place that Fulton Sheen, where he ministered when he was in England. But Sheen was asked one time toward the end of his life, he gave a sermon and someone said, Archbishop, how long did you work on that sermon? And he said, 45 years, So it's that same idea. Your whole formation in a way goes into it and you're relying on everything you've read and heard and done before. And so there is that, under the surface quality of the iceberg. But it's a subtle, complicated process, I would say, if you really dig into it, how you get ready for even a short presentation. The one I gave this morning was about 20, 25 minutes, but there's a bit of process behind that.
Yeah. There was, it's been attributed to various American presidents, so I'll just say anonymous, but they were asked to give a speech, and they said, how long is the speech? He said, because if it's half an hour, give me a week, a couple of weeks to prepare. If it's 10 minutes, give me a month or two to prepare.
Yeah.
If there's no time limit, I'll begin now.
That's right.
So I think it leans into that sense of the distinction, I guess, is between proximate and remote preparation. So remote preparation, the cultivation of virtues, the learning of, attitudes, skills and knowledge that helps one to be a speaker. Yeah. And then they say the proximate, I've got this talk with this particular deadline. So maybe we just scale back to the kind of remote preparation. So, you've done theological studies for the priesthood, your seminary rector, bishop. What's that kind of remote? What are some attitudes or principles that could help somebody who's trying to be in public speaking or preaching?
Remember years ago, a teacher of mine at the seminary said, preachers are like sharks, You're going through the water and all you're doing is looking for food all the time. So and that's true though, you're always aware. I could use that. Oh yeah, that's good. That story, that insight, that perspective, that idea, that book I just read, that'd be good for. And usually which talks are coming up. And so you're in your reading. And one thing I would say, read, and read. If you're going to be a public speaker, you're trading in words. And to be immersed in the world of words and to be at home with words and to use them as tools and to love them, have a refined sense of words. That's really key, I think. But you're like a shark. You're always on the lookout, for a good image, a good idea, a good turn of phrase. Remember in, what was the movie? Shakespeare in Love, remember? And they show Shakespeare going through the town and he hears one guy yelling at the other, a plague on both your houses. And he kind of made a mental note of that. And there's something of it, I think, in public speakers.
So do you have like a notebook? Do you keep them kind of analog, like a written notebook,
no,
or digital? Or?
I don't do that, but I would make mental notes, yeah. And I would relate things to talks I know that are coming up. So for this tour, of London, I knew the various places I'd be speaking. I'll give you an example. So last night I spoke at Parliament, and I began with the story about Gandhi, right? The young Gandhi coming to London. Well, at the time, this is many months ago, I was reading Gandhi's autobiography for another project. And I'm reading along, and he tells this marvelous story about when he's a young kid, shy, afraid, coming to London, and then finding the Bible and finding the Sermon on the Mount. And I think, hey, that would be really good for my talk in Parliament. So I remember to my computer, I was in LA at the time, and I did write that up as a little vignette and thought, okay, I'll use that for that talk.
And there's a good organizing principle. Like Cicero talks about his kind of 5 canons of speaking or communication. So you've got invention, which is, kind of bringing that process basically of the shark, of finding the
Yeah.
different arguments that will come to, and distilling and that processing. So, and then arrangement, so bringing it into a kind of, logical, coherent structure that makes sense. And style, memory, and delivery. And it's always struck me that particularly, and nothing against priests and preaching, but there's so much of, I guess, theological formation that means you do a lot on, let's say, invention, so the crafting of an argument, and arrangement. So you can have many wonderful university sermons.
Yeah, right.
But that style, memory, and delivery, what does that look like for you?
Well, and I rely a lot on Aristotle's, back in his rhetoric from the ancient world. Every good speech, a persuasive speech, has to have logos. There has to be logic, arrangement, and arguments being made. And I like the word argument. It's not a popular word, but it's a good word. That every persuasive speech, and a homily is certainly that, should have an argumentative form. I don't mean contentious. I mean it's laying out a demonstration of some kind. So it has to have a logical structure. But the second thing Aristotle said is pathos. There has to be feeling. It has to be pathetic in that literal sense, that the feeling and the passion of the speaker comes through. Fulton Sheen put it this way, that people only really listen to an excited speaker. And that's true, isn't it? If you're not excited about what you're saying, why should the people get excited about it? That's why Sheen said, you should never read from a text. Because the answer would be, well, look, if you can't memorize the darn thing, how do you expect me to remember it? So logos, pathos, and the final thing for Aristotle was ethos. The character of the speaker has to come through, and he thought that was the most important thing. If you're saying one thing and you're living in a totally different way, and people know that or they can sense that, you will not be persuasive. So those 3 things. You mentioned memory. Very interesting to me. Like the talk at Parliament, I'll give you an example. So I would have put those notes together. I don't write it out word for word. I have kind of like talking points, elaborated bullet points. I would have written that last spring probably. And then we were supposed to be here in September. It was called off. So I kept it in my computer. Well, I took it out maybe a week ago, right? There's the talk at Parliament. Oh, okay, you're right. I got Gandhi, I remember, and then I did this. Well, then in the course of the flight over here, the course of that first full day, I basically memorized the talking points. So I had about 6 pages maybe of elaborated talking points. I like to reach the point in a talk like that. If someone just took my notes away, or hey, we lost your notes, it wouldn't bother me. And I don't think I looked at them very often last night because I basically had them memorized. So that's what I do with let's say a 45 or 50 minute presentation. And I do use some of those old medieval memory techniques. They talk about the house of memory. You imagine a house with its different rooms. And the first part of your talk with the Gandhi, come in. The Gandhi, he's in that, front room. And then I go from that room into the kitchen. And that's where that next part of the paper is. And I go from the kitchen into the dining room. And that's where that third part is. And I go upstairs in that first front bedroom. That's the fourth part of my talk. So that's the house of memory. And you put the different parts of your talk in the different rooms. That's extraordinarily helpful. And that's an ancient technique.
The Greek technique, yeah.
But we've kind of lost that. I think maybe the computers have not helped us there. We think everything is, can be stored in a computer, but learning how to store it in your brain, and that's just a super useful way to do it.
So sometimes there's maybe an immature way of thinking about it, that somehow the scriptures mean that you've got to do everything off of the cuff. And of course, there are moments, I think, when you're called to do something extemporaneously. The Holy Spirit might, guide you to kind of set aside. But have you ever been challenged on that sense of kind of memorizing things?
Challenged, meaning that you shouldn't do it that way?
You shouldn't do it, yeah.
No, the trick is, and I learned this from Sheen, really. Sheen would speak in his television performances for about 30 minutes without a note in front of him, not reading anything, but speaking very articulately. How'd you do that? And Sheen would say, well, the hours of preparation, and what he used to do, he was a great linguist. He would speak the talk out loud in French and then in Italian to make sure he had it in his mind, the ideas. And then he would speak it through in English, and then he was ready to go on the air. I do that. So if I have the outline, basically, I don't do it in the different languages, but I'll talk it out loud, like in a car or in my room, if people won't think I'm out of my mind. But I will speak it out loud and walk around the room and then try something, or well, that word didn't work, or no, that connection wasn't properly made. And that's how I refine it. I did some of that in London here, walking along the rock over the Thames. I was speaking some of that Parliament talk out loud. So that's how I work it.
And I think he also said that if you just continue to think about the ideas, you're kind of processing all of the stimulus that you're receiving, that eventually all you're doing is saying what you think. So you don't need to, when somebody asks me what my name is or where my address, I don't need to think about it. I don't have it memorized in a sense. It's integrated.
Right. But it takes an enormous amount of preparation. That's true, to reach that point where you have that freedom from the text and you've so internalized it. But you have to have the logos in place. A lot of people my generation, were taught, hey, don't get rid of that text and, just speak from the heart. And the problem with that was logos took a vacation. So it was a lot of pathos and a lot of free association. And let me tell you about my vacation. But it didn't have a logical structure, argumentative form. And see, that isn't compelling to an audience, because if you can't follow what's being said and A doesn't follow from B and from C, you lose interest. That's when you drift off, So you have to have the logos. But if you're missing pathos, same problem. Someone's droning his way through a speech and doesn't seem at all interested in his own speech. Audience won't get interested. So it's that combination of the two things. But it takes a lot of time and effort to internalize rhetoric to that degree.
And I guess one of the other challenges a speaker has is that if you think of the Venn diagram of those three, modes of persuasion, so the logos, the ethos, and the pathos, different talks will sit differently. There's a kind of constellation. So if you're giving a legal speech, then of course you want it to major on logos and less on pathos. If you're an angry mob, it's pure pathos.
Right.
So in terms of modulating, so I've kind of noticed the difference between the talk at Parliament yesterday, say, and the talk to kind of an in-house Catholic audience today. So how do you do some of that kind of modulation as you move between those modes?
I think the single hardest thing in public speaking is fitting your speech to the audience. That's the hardest thing. What is my audience? What are they open to? What are they capable of? What level should I go at? I find that's the hardest thing. I remember once years ago, there was a conference at Mundelein Seminary, very high level. It was the Bible and something, and it was very high level academic. So I prepared this very serious paper, 20-page academic paper, and I read it because that's what we have to do. And afterwards, this lady came up to me and she said, she had listened to my sermons and all this. And she said, "What was that?" And I said, "Well, it's a paper." She goes, "I brought high school kids down from Wisconsin. They didn't know what you were talking about." I said, "Well, ma'am, it was an academic." "Well, yeah, but it was a complete waste of our time." I'm sorry. But so that was an example of the speech not fitting at least that part of my audience. That's maybe the hardest thing, is to get that right. If the rest of your life, all you have to do is write academic papers and deliver them, in a way, that's really easy. When I went to Oxford a couple years ago, after the Newman canonization, I had this serious paper, 20 pages, epistemology, all this stuff. That's easy. Get to a podium, got text in front of me, you just read it, with a little bit of, energy. But that's easy. Last time was much harder. When you have an audience in front of you and you want to engage them, you have something substantive and logical to say, but you don't want to just read, words. That's more challenging. That's more of a performance then, Sometimes it's appropriate to read a paper. Sometimes that's the right thing to do.
I guess easy. And good public speaking often requires you to repeat yourself quite a lot, because otherwise it's the pressure of kind of constantly having new things to say. So I guess I notice, if you're giving a speech, sometimes there's, the kind of Barron highlights, like, there's Barron's best bits in a sense.
No,
so do you find it exhausting to have to do it again and again, finding that passion?
No, if the audience is different, I don't. And to that point, I do think it's very important in teaching and public speaking that you have, not that you're, I hope, tediously giving the same talk all the time, but that there's certain points of reference that come through a lot. And then people, oh yeah, I got it. Oh yeah, that's yeah. Mm-hmm. Because that's an old principle too, is repetitio mater studiorum. Repetition is the mother of studies. And so when you hear something repeatedly, that's helpful to people.
So just before we go to a break, have you got Pope Francis recently gave advice, he's given variously advice to priests on preaching. What would be Bishop Barron's advice to priests on preaching?
Well, I would logos, pathos, ethos is not bad. I mean, stay with Aristotle's recommendations from the rhetoric. But I think the needful thing at the moment is probably more logos. I think make sure that the speech you're giving has a beginning, a middle, and end, has an argumentative form. I mean, it's making a point in a coherent way, and that you could. This was said to me years ago, and it's helpful that you could put the theme of your sermon on one of those little signs outside the church. If you're going by a church and there's a sign with a little like motto on it, if you can't do that, you haven't distilled it enough. You haven't thought it through sufficiently. So can you put the theme of your sermon on one of those little signs in like a handful of words? I'd say that.
Thank you. So we're just going to take a break, and after the break, we're going to explore a little bit more about Bishop Barron's tour to London and the kind of big theme of the life of St. Thomas More. Thank you very much. God bless. So welcome back to the Catholic Voices podcast with my guest, Bishop Robert Barron. So we're going to just move now to talking about our week here in London.
Yeah,
so
good.
we've been preparing for longer than expected.
Yeah.
So we were meant to have it in September gone, and you were there in Rome on the Thursday, and then later that evening the Queen died.
The Queen died, yeah.
I remember talking to your brother John on the phone. I think you were in a restaurant in Rome. And
We were in a restaurant with my brother and Father Paul Murray. I don't know if your listeners know him, but a great spiritual teacher at the Angelicum in Rome, an old friend. And we were out for dinner. And before dinner, he said, I said, the Queen evidently is quite ill. And he said, oh, I'm sure she'll be, she'll survive for many more. And then in the course of that dinner, we got the word that she had died. And so it was difficult, but it was the right decision not to come because, that week was very chaotic here. And so anyway, rescheduled for now, and here we are.
Yeah, and it's been a fantastic start. So at this point, we had Parliament on Monday. So you had a tour of Parliament, which you'd never had a tour of Parliament before. Just share with us a little bit of your impressions.
I loved it. I was saying to someone this morning, it really was one of the most memorable days of my life yesterday, because I love history and I love, British history and all that. And I'd been around Parliament. I've certainly been in Westminster Abbey, et cetera. I'd never been inside the Parliament building, and every room, not only are they stunningly beautiful rooms, but with so much historical resonance. So you walk into Westminster Hall, and that's where Thomas More, was tried. And then you go next door to what was the chapel, but it's where the House of Commons met, like at the time of the American Revolution. And Edmund Burke would have, been arguing his position in that room. And then you cross over into the present House of Commons that had been destroyed during the Second World War and then rebuilt. But Churchill would have been, in this place. Then you go across, and there's the House of Lords, and there's that gilded throne. And I mean, there's so much resonance. And speaking as an American, obviously we broke from what do I say, England, Great Britain, the UK. We broke from you guys, but at the same time, we're all in a way culturally English. I mean, we're so influenced by English history and so on. So to go into a place like the Parliament is very moving. I found it very moving. And then the chance to give the talk there to that marvelous audience last night, including several MPs, it just made it one of the most memorable days of my life.
Yeah, it was a packed crowd, and I think there was at least 20 members and peers of all houses, Catholic, Christian, and we took as a theme for that. So Pope Benedict had given a historic address when he visited for the papal visit in September 2010. And the theme of the speech, really, there's a line in it. He said, religion isn't a problem for legislators to solve, but a vital contributor to the national conversation. It's an excellent speech, well worth reading. And so we're kind of playing with those themes. What is it that you hope to say to them, or what were you trying to say in that speech?
I think just to remind everybody of how Christianity is so deeply ingrained in our culture. That we've been shaped willy-nilly by it. I mean, whether we know it or not, it's in the cultural DNA of anyone who's been influenced by Christianity. I closed the speech, and I was very happy. I think he was a peer, you say, right, from the House of Lords. There was an older gentleman. And I had made reference to the Union Jack. And I said, which, as I look out over the Houses of Parliament, hovering over the whole thing is the Union Jack, which is 3 crosses kind of interposed on each other, right? I said, how odd when you think about it, that central to this national symbol is the instrument of torture on which a young Jewish rabbi is put to death around the year 30 AD. That's the image, that's the symbol that we have, and how deeply strange that is. And it speaks to the distinctiveness, the uniqueness, the wonder, the odd quality of Christianity that holds God became one of us, died for us, was raised from the dead. That reality is in the flag, which hovers over the whole of the British establishment, you know. And I remember he said to me, I've been in this house, you know, for 40 some years, and I've never thought of the Union Jack that way. And I thought, okay, that's the point I wanted to make. That's what I wanted to convey.
And that's the job of a great preacher, isn't it? Because there's so much within a church, but it's a kind of, they lack potency if a preacher can't bring them to life to say what is what is the fact. It's almost kind of just preaching reality as it ought to be seen, in a sense. So
Yeah.
the kind of that kind of prophetic role of preaching.
One thing I was very happy to be able to begin the speech with Gandhi, and I mentioned sometimes it takes the outsider to look at a text with really fresh eyes. That Christians have been reading Matthew 5, 6, and 7, you know, for centuries and centuries, and turn the other cheek and resist not evil and love your enemy, etc. And it become maybe kind of a banal abstraction for a lot of Christians. But Gandhi, reading it for the first time, it took his breath away. And he realized, this is fresh, this is new, this is something that could actually work. And then by God, he proved that it could work. And then he was imitated by some of the key players in the 20th century, from King to Tutu to John Paul II. And what I argued last night was, that's the dynamite of the church, that's the power of the church. And Gandhi, the outsider, saw it. But he helped Christians to realize, oh yeah, that is at the heart of our great message. And then I tied it to the doctrine of creation and God making the world through a nonviolent act, tied it to the ethic of the sermon, then finally to the Paschal mystery, the dying and rising of Jesus. And I guess I wanted to do in a way what Gandhi did for his Christian audience. Like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, or I'm seeing it with a fresh perspective. That was my goal last night.
And it's revealing of blind spots. I think one of the things, there's a concept called the curse of knowledge. So it's like the longer that you've participated or studied in something, the harder it is to remember what it was like before.
Yes.
And, how much of evangelization is impeded because, we don't realize what we don't know. These blind spots exist. That kind of sense of the curse of knowledge. How do we help people? How do we help evangelists actually to get over the curse of knowledge?
I mean, how awful that Christianity has become for many Christians a kind of tired old Christianity. Oh yeah, that's Christianity. Where Christianity is, when you get it, it's always fresh and always strange and always unnerving, and it compels you to see in a completely different way. Paul saying, I know one thing, Christ and him crucified. And what? That would have struck them as the oddest possible thing to be proclaiming. You're proclaiming someone who was crucified? And then so to get that, what's at stake there? Why he could say it with such blithe confidence? It's only in light of the resurrection. And Jesus Christ is Lord. We say, oh yeah, Jesus Christ is Lord. It's a nice, pious, spiritual sentiment. That was a bomb going off in the ancient world when Caesar was the Lord. And these first Christians with no army behind them, no institutional support whatsoever, were blithely saying, no, Jesus is Lord. That's why they all ended up in prison, or most of them ended up killed, because the powers that be knew exactly what they meant. Well, the fact that we've lost that we would never hear a phrase like Jesus is Lord and say, oh, yeah, ho-hum. That we wouldn't hear that and say, that's a revolution. That's an explosion. So that's part of what I want to recover, is that very liberating oddness of Christianity.
Mm. And I think that kind of links in with in a sense, odd figure to English people. If you're not Catholic, this kind of figure of Thomas More. It's a big theme of your week here. I think I hadn't watched A Man for All Seasons until you'd spoken about it. I think you're saying it was your favourite film.
Yeah.
You kind of watch it periodically. So what does Thomas More mean to you? And we're going, of course, to visit his cell in the Tower of London this week. We're going to have a reception at the Great Hall Lincoln's Inn, where as a young lawyer he was received to the bar in the 15th century. So what does Thomas More mean to you?
It means a lot to me. And it began with the movie. So I would have seen A Man for All Seasons when I was 16, probably for the first time. Maybe a high school teacher of ours showed it to us, I forget. But I've watched it, no kidding, every single year of my life since then. When I was a professor at the seminary, I would always have a little evening on his feast day. And I'd invite, it was during the summer, so the fellow faculty members come to my room and watch Man for All Seasons. I always showed it to my students during the school year. And, Paul Scofield, the great Shakespearean actor, plays More in such a memorable way. So in my imagination, of course, I know the great Holbein portrait. I know what the historical Thomas More looked like. But I always think of Paul Scofield. And I always think of the figure from that play. And I could probably recite most of that play by memory, by heart. And it had a huge impact on my own thinking and my own prioritization of values. It's a prime example of a saint teaching Christianity more than the theologians do, even as I reverence theology. But a saint teaches you what it's about. And that image of Scofield playing More still, sings to me. So that's how More came to mean a lot to me.
And one of the elements of this week that I'm really looking forward to is we're doing a conference on the theme of sharing the church's story. And I think in many ways it's a significant moment in England for the UK, because since the pandemic, I would say it's probably going to be one of the largest gathering of Catholics in the UK. So we're so grateful to have you there. But I think your address, you're going to speak about the role of the laity in evangelization. So what is it you're going to say? Well,
maybe just stay with More for a second, because he's a great layman. He's not a priest. He thought he might want to be a priest as a young man, and he always had an intense spirituality, but precisely as a layman, precisely as someone in the world. So More as a lawyer, and then as a politician, then as a statesman at the highest level, becomes Lord Chancellor of England, so the highest appointed position in the realm. A literary figure of great significance, known throughout Europe, Utopia and other works. He's a model of Christian humanism. That there's something beautiful about the monastic or Carthusian life and all that, but More exhibits the lay style, to use Baltzar's language, the lay style of being a Christian in the world. And that's super important now. And see, look at Vatican II, the universal call to holiness. The call of the laity is now to sanctify the seculum, the secular order. So the order of politics and law and science and entertainment and business, finance. That's not my job as a priest or a bishop. That's the laity's world. Now go forth and Christify it. Well, see, More knew that in the 16th century. More understood that in his bones. And then the other side of it, he lived that life as richly as it could be lived, but he knew, okay, push has now come to shove, because I cannot stay in this position and be true to my conscience because of what Henry VIII is doing, because of the moves Henry VIII was making. More knew, I can't with integrity continue. And then he, resigned from that life, and then paid the ultimate price for that integrity. So he's in both those ways such a model of a lay commitment to the world.
One of our great patrons for Catholic Voices is John Henry Newman.
Yeah.
And just seeing the kind of links there between kind of conscience and when he converted in 1845 and stuff. I think his sister never spoke to him again. That sense of there's a real English theme. What's your sense in the UK for Catholics, having to make those kind of conscientious decisions? How can figures like Newman and More help lay Catholics as, they kind of feel at the coalface? That's what prevents us from doing evangelization, right? It's the sense of the fear of what's going to happen with this. What would your advice be to Catholics to encourage them?
Yeah, because you're right. Newman didn't pay the ultimate price the way